going to look at complex sentences. So just a reminder, a clause is a group of words with its own subject and verb. We've been looking at independent clauses, which has a subject and verb, and it can stand by itself as a complete sentence. It's a complete thought. Put them together, we have compound sentences. When there's just one, it's a simple sentence. But in both cases, you have independent clauses. There is another type of clause. It's called a subordinate clause, and it also has a subject and verb, but it does not express a complete thought, and it cannot stand by itself. It always is combined with an independent clause, and when they're by themselves, it's a fragment. So, for example, after she finished her report, we have a subject and we have a verb. She finished. But we're left with, well, what happened after she finished her report? This is an incomplete thought. After she finished her report, what? This is a subordinate clause, subject, verb, but does not express a complete thought. It is a fragment. Another example, when the sun set. You have the subject sun, you have the verb set, but it's not a complete thought. When the sun set, what? What happened? Okay, it doesn't stand by itself on its own. It needs more information with it. A complex sentence is a sentence that has one independent clause and it has one subordinate clause. So the independent clause is referred to as the main clause, and the subordinate clause can be referred to as subordinate or dependent. It can be either. It's the same thing. There's just two different words for it. So we're going to go with main clause and subordinate clause. We have this sentence. This is the street that he describes in the book. This is the street is your main clause. Subject, verb. This is the street, period. Okay, this could stand on its own as a complete thought by itself. This is the street, period. It's combined with the subordinate clause that he describes in the book. We have our subject, he. We have the verb describes in our clause. In the book is a prepositional phrase. However, if we just left it on its own, that he describes in the book, it's not a complete thought. It only works when it's combined with our main clause. This one you could not separate out. This one you could. Another example. Because she can speak Spanish well, we can understand her. Again, we can understand her as our main clause. The subject is we, can understand is your verb, helping verb, main verb. Her is your direct object. It can stand on its own as a complete sentence. We don't need this first piece here. We can understand her. It's a sentence. It's her main clause. Because she can speak Spanish well, has a subject, she, has a verb, can speak, has a direct object, Spanish. She can speak Spanish. However, because we have the word because in front of it, it can't stand on its own. Because she can speak Spanish well, what? It's not a complete thought on its own, therefore it's a subordinate clause. When the sun set, the caravan stopped for the night. Again, the caravan stopped for the night is our main clause. It doesn't need this part here. This is a complete thought on its own. Caravans is your subject, stopped is your verb, for the night is a prepositional phrase. When the sun set, we've already discussed why that's a subordinate clause, and your subject and your verb. The mother camel carried the load while the baby camel walked behind. The mother camel carried the load is a complete thought. I could put a period here. It would make sense. You're not left wondering anything. Camel is your subject. Carried is your verb. Load is your direct object. This is your main clause. While the baby camel walked behind is your subordinate clause. It cannot stand on its own. It needs this main clause in order to make sense. Camel is your subject. Walked is your verb. While the baby camel walked behind. If we tried to put it on our own, we'd have a big question mark going, while the baby camel walked behind what, right? And that's answered in our main clause. You should note that subordinate clauses can come before the main clause or they can come after the main clause. When they come before the main clause, you always put a comma to separate them. Okay, always, regardless of what word it starts with. When it comes after the main clause, you don't put a comma unless it's starting with the word while. When it starts with the word while, we put a comma. But if I were going to move this, we can understand her because she can speak Spanish well, I would not put a clause there, like I do not have one up here using that. The words that start your subordinate clause are conjunctions. And there are certain ones that many subordinate clauses start with. You should become familiar to you as the conjunction beginning a subordinate clause. Words like that, which, who, whom, whose, since, where, when, after, although, as if, as long as, because, before, even though, if, in order that, so that, than, though, unless, until, whenever, wherever, and while. The most commonly used ones are while, which, and that. Those are the ones we use the most. But you will see these others, and it's good to mix it up and use some of these others. In order that, provided that, so that, all of those are conjunctions beginning subordinate clauses. Some of these can also be prepositions. Since, after, as, before, until can be prepositions and part of a prepositional phrase. So it's important to be able to understand the difference between when it's a preposition and when it's a conjunction and you have a subordinate clause. So I used after as an example. After is a pretty common preposition. It's in your song. After the game, they got pizza. Here, after is a preposition. After what? The game. There's no subject, there's no verb. It's just a prepositional phrase, after the game. Compare that with this example over here. After they won the game, they got pizza. Here, we have a subject they, we have a verb won. Even though I still have game, after is not a preposition in this case. It is a conjunction, and it is beginning our subordinate clause after they won the game. They got pizza is the main clause. So the way you can tell is to identify, is there a subject verb following the word? If there's a subject verb, you have a clause. If there's no subject verb, you just have a noun, then you have a prepositional phrase.